Welcome to our third in a series of 5 of the Mental Health Mountains, in that sense, podcast. This is in the run up to our 5 Peak Challenge, where I'm doing a walk to raise some money. But these are the 5 mental health challenges, and we're going to talk about them and how they impact you. They might not impact you directly, but they may impact you indirectly with your family, friends, or loved ones. I'm your host today, Warren Evans. I'm Chief Exec of Sports Chaplains UK, and I'm with my very good friend and expert on all things, maybe not all things, but a lot more than me, Dr. Allan Johnston. Welcome, Allan.
Welcome, and thank you, Warren. Thanks for the introduction. It's great to be with you again.
Allan, why don't you just introduce yourself?
Of course, yes. I'm Allan Johnston, Dr. Allan Johnston. I'm a sports psychiatrist, so that means I'm a doctor of mental health, and I do that predominantly now in sports. So I work with Team GB via the English Institute of Sport across all of those Olympic or Paralympic sports that you might imagine. I work with the League Managers Association, so I look after football managers across England. I work specifically with Burnley FC, so we've been celebrating our recent promotion back to the Premier League this weekend. If my voice sounds a bit hoarse, I must apologise. And I'm based in Leeds, as well as being a doctor. I'm lots of other things too. I'm a husband, I'm a father, I'm a son, and it's a great pleasure to be with you today, Warren.
That's awesome. When you say that, husband, father, son, I think you're going to break out in the gladiator theme of and you are one of those gladiators. So we have looked at certain mountains. We've looked at the mountain of depression. We've looked at anxiety. And if you've not heard them, I'd recommend that you go back and listen to them. They're on our website or they're on Spotify. And there's some great tools in there, some golden nuggets that Alan's kindly shared with you. And I'm sure you'll find it helpful. But today we're going to be looking at addictions. So, Allan, I guess there's loads of things. Just explain the root word of addiction, because people are thinking in certain silos. Just why don't you give a big overview and then we maybe drill down into certain things?
Yeah, of course. You're right to say as addictions are a complex, complicated range of conditions. When we think about addictions, people might often go straight in their mind to things like alcohol or substances such as drugs. And of course, many people have a problematic use of those substances, but an addiction would be a behavior to an unhelpful behavior linked to anything. So it would include prescription medications. We see in a range of sports, including rugby league, that there might be use of sleeping medications that can become unhelpful. A person could become addicted to any pleasurable activity. So it could also be a non-substance-based addiction. We see a lot of gambling addiction, sometimes in sports and in different sports. Again, it could be food. It could be a whole range of substances or experiences that are often pleasurable initially, but can become habit-forming and can become addictive. It's also worth mentioning that there's a whole range of behaviours. Let's say we take alcohol, a substance that's completely legal here in the UK and widely used. You and I would have celebrated half of Shandy back with the Bradford Bulls many years ago, and we often use alcohol at weddings, christenings, a range of events. People have a drink at New Year's Eve, and so alcohol is something that's part of a lot of cultures and a lot of celebrations. And some of these substances might be very helpful. Sleeping medications are helpful for sleep, for example. But there could be a whole spectrum of responses whereby the use of a medication or a behavior is helpful. It could become unhelpful. It could become harmful. And these substances, for it to be an addiction, they're harmful in a number of different ways, biologically, psychologically, socially. So it's worth saying there's a whole spectrum of behaviors around food or medications or alcohol that could be helpful or become unhelpful and addictive.
That's really helpful, because when I think of addictions, you always think of the natural unhealthy ones. But I guess we talk about gambling addiction, alcoholic. You've heard the phrase as well, workaholic, which again has damaging effects, but just not in always the physical, but it does have physical because you generally eat poorly, but also on relational. And I guess that's, if we look through the lens, I guess, when we look at addiction, because I always think of elite athletes and they've got to, on one level, be addicted to do or be excel in what they're doing. So when does
I'm pushing a little bit here, and then we can dig a bit beyond deeper. But when does something that is healthy become unhealthy?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. That really gets to the essence of addictions. There's a simple sort of phrase that teaches in medical school where is something is a problem if it's a problem. So that means a sort of a behavior or a diagnosis becomes an issue if it causes a problem. What could a problem mean? So it could be a problem, as I said, biologically, psychologically, or socially. Let's say we take something like alcohol use. That could have some benefits socially. It could be a way of socializing, enjoying your time, relaxing. But when it becomes a problem, it could harm a person biologically. So we know alcohol has long-term effects on the liver, on the pancreas, on the brain. Alcohol is linked to conditions including dementia, as well as conditions like cirrhosis of the liver or hepatitis. It could have a problem physically in other ways, more short-term, could affect the quality of sleep. Alcohol has a lot of calories. I'm sorry to tell you to say that a glass of red wine has the same calories as a jam donut. So it could be calorific, which could be bad for our weight and health. And
that just justifies me eating loads of donuts now, Alan. Just in case. I just thought a glass of red wine.
So you could develop a donut addiction, I suppose, but certainly, so it could be harmful biologically, physically, in terms of cardiovascular health or weight. Psychologically, we know that alcohol can be a depressant, as well as being used for enjoyable occasions. It can affect mood. It can cause a temporary effect in mood, a sort of a hangover effect of low energy, low mood, low productivity. Or it could have a more long-term effect. Alcohol also damages the ability of antidepressant medications to work. That's something called first-pass metabolism. So as you take an antidepressant tablet, it's digested through your gut, your esophagus, your stomach. It's absorbed, and the medicine has to get past the liver before it comes back through the heart to your brain to lift your mood. And alcohol speeds up the way that the liver breaks down most substances, including medications. So more alcohol equals less of an antidepressant effect. So alcohol can have that double-edged sword with low mood, whereby it can cause low mood and prevent its treatment. If that makes sense. So sort of a catch-22 effect. And then socially, there are a number of symptoms of dependency, which we can talk about perhaps in a moment, but alcohol can take over a person's social life. It can cause what's called primacy, whereby alcohol becomes the main thought that the person have, their main motivation. How can I get my next drink? Might be a thought that someone who's severely dependent might have. And alcohol can take primacy over other important aspects of life, such as work, family, church, etc. So it's a problem if it's a problem, if that makes sense. And the problem can be in many different ways. Biopsychosocially is the model that we often use.
And I guess sometimes the challenge isn't that the individual thinks it's a problem, and if they do, it's generally too late. But what are the warning signs that maybe a coach or a team or a family member should be aware of, those little telltale signs, for a better phrase?
Yeah. Well, firstly, you're right to just bring it back to sport, because I suppose alcohol does play a role in sporting addictions, probably alongside gambling, much more so in my experience than illicit substances. So it's not impossible, of course, for an athlete to use illegal substances, drugs like cocaine or amphetamines. But in my experience of doing this for a few years now, that is very unlikely because, of course, professional athletes are tested for substances. Society has drawn a line, of course, with substances that are legal, alcohol, caffeine, and substances that are illegal. And the testing regime broadly follows that. And so it's very rare in my experience that an athlete would use an illicit drug like cocaine within competition, because if they were tested and found to be positive for something like that, they could be facing something like a 4-year ban from their sport. And therefore, athletes might be more likely to turn to, if you like, addictions that are both legal and permissible by UCAD, which leads us to alcohol and gambling, both of which are legal but can become unhelpful. Your question is about looking for those telltale signs. So there are certain symptoms of dependency. And what is, in a sense, logical is that these are symptoms that apply to any dependency. So let's compare, say, a gambling dependency and an alcohol dependency. They have the same types of symptoms. The first is an excessive use. So people might drink too much, for their health, or they might gamble too much for their finances. It can become a pattern that's hard to break. So it can become a habit. People might drink in a stereotyped drinking pattern. They might drink the same substances in the same venues with the same friends in the same way, often drink alone in a person that has a severe alcohol problem. And the person might gamble in the same way, on the same sports, at the same place, at the same bookies, or in the same online betting forum. Both have something called tolerance. So people become tolerant to alcohol, meaning that they need more alcohol for the same effect. In effect, you might be saying they need more alcohol to get drunk. And the same applies to gambling. People might bet more and more and more for the same buzz. Their stakes might become higher. Even if they're losing more money, they might bet more or chase losses. People might try and make up for the losses by betting more to win back that money. I mentioned primacy and neglect. So alcohol or gambling or any other addiction can take over life. It can become the prime motivation for the person. First thing they think of when they wake up, the last thing they think of before they go to bed. And it can cause a neglect of other important aspects of their roles. I mentioned, my roles as a husband or father or doctor. And a dependency would take primacy over those other roles that I currently find important. And then the last symptom, two more, withdrawal symptoms. So people withdraw when they have less of the substance. They might have a hangover with alcohol, or might feel down when they don't get the same buzz from gambling. And finally, harm. It's a problem if it's a problem. So for something to be a dependency, it will be causing some degree of harm biopsychosocially. Just run through those again. It's an excessive use, a tolerance, using more for the same gain, a neglect or primacy as it takes over life, withdrawal symptoms, and some form of harm. And for a person to have a dependency on any substance or any activity, it would have those types of symptoms.
That's really interesting. Just as you were sharing that, something popped into my head, because when we look at telltale signs, we certainly, it's not just alcohol, but it's sometimes easier one and more well known, and maybe we'll dip into some more sports. But with alcohol, you've got the phrase a functioning alcoholic, where they look and perform their duties fine, but there is still an addiction there. But because they can perform okay, people either ignore it or they ignore it. What does that happen in other addictions, or is it? What does that mean? Does that come back to you just need to drink more, or is that what? Just explain what that might mean, or other addictions.
It's quite a common phrase, isn't it? A functional alcoholic, or something like that. It's probably not something that I give too much weight to, although of course it exists as a phrase. Within elite sport, I would have seen coaches who are dependent on, for example, alcohol, and they might say to me, I'm functioning, like I'm getting to tournaments, I'm getting to matches, I'm talking to athletes. But one coach said to me, I'm 70% of the coach that I should be, and 70% isn't enough when I'm heading to the next Olympics, And this person really might care about being a father or a brother. And being 70% of the father you want to be is also probably not sufficient for a lot of people's aims for themselves. So I think the phrase functioning alcoholic, firstly, it's probably only talking about that social aspect. I suppose you could be functioning at work, but still be low in mood at home and, gaining weight, being unhealthy, damaging your liver biologically and psychologically. But even just taking that social aspect of the idea of functioning, I suppose it depends what your challenges are and what you want to do and your standards for yourself as a coach or as a dad. Because 70% of the coach you need to be might not be enough for that level of competition or for the person's own standards for themselves. And if we don't meet our own standards, that tends to cause other feelings such as guilt or remorse or regret, which is no good for our mental health either.
That's a really helpful explanation, because we sometimes, I won't say excuse things, but we can flower them up. We can make them more acceptable, as if just because they can function in one area, as you've said, it doesn't mean they're functioning or being where they need to be, or where their family needs to be, or their colleagues need them to be, when they could be easily there if they had could handle healthily this addiction. I think that's really, really helpful. So just as we continue to look at those addictions, where do you see that in sport? What are the issues when we look through the lens of sport and elite sport, when people are judging? The pressures are immense, aren't they? So what are the likelihood of addictions? If I've seen, I always say you've got to be addictive. an addictive personality. Not always, that's not positive or negative, it's just a statement in that sense. But what does that look like through your lenses in that sense when you're looking at sport?
I would say, just taking mental health as a whole, there are some mental health conditions that present more in athletes than the general population. One example would be eating disorders that present more in weight-dependent sports whereby you tend to be faster if you weigh less, but there's a power to weight ratio sort of calculation. So we see more eating disorders in sport than in the general population. Some conditions we see less in sport. It's very hard to be an elite athlete and have a major sort of psychotic illness like schizophrenia. So we tend to see schizophrenia less in athletes than in the general population. When it comes to addictions, I think the best evidence would show that we just see different addictions in sport, whether it's more or less, I'm not sure, but it's certainly different patterns of addictions. In the elite athletes in the testing program, as I said, I imagine, I would take an educated guess to say there's less use of illicit substances, of illegal drugs, than in the general population. But the pressures of sport, as you say, are immense, and those pressures come out somehow. And so we tend to see more addictions like gambling. We tend to see more addictions like alcohol. If you like, addictions that are thought of as being legal or socially acceptable, but can still be very harmful. So we tend to see a different pattern of those in sport. And certainly I see a lot of athletes, coaches, support staff, they're working very stressful environments. There are other stressful environments too, other places that are hard to work. But sports are often stressful environments. There's a performance pressure. They're doing it in front of the media. Feedback from fans is not overwhelmingly positive all of the time. And the demands of performing every Tuesday, Saturday, say as a football manager, are very high. And so, yeah, I would see patterns of addictions differ. But if we take the sport of football, for example, I would see more alcohol and gambling dependency in football than I might in a member of the general public. And I suppose we probably need to have a think about then how we would go about treating these things, because each addiction is different. But there are some common principles in how we might go about treating or supporting those addictions.
And I guess certain addictions release certain chemicals, but I'm just, it's interesting you said for an elite athlete, certainly football or anything on public display in that sense. I've lost my mum a couple of years ago, and people are very gracious and kind and allow you on one level to grieve. But I guess in sport, they give you a week off and expect you to be normal the next game. They don't expect, even though they may know you've lost something important to you, maybe a family member, it might be, whatever it might be, but there is no grace, for a better word. There is no consideration. They just want results. Fans want results, which must be incredibly fickle on one level. We say we love our club and we love play for the badge, yet we don't really love them. We love winning.
Yeah, it's as you know very well. Yeah, sport is quite a harsh world. As I said, there are other environments that are difficult to work in. The NHS can be a difficult place to work in too. But yeah, I would say in sport you do sometimes find what we might think as toxic environments or bullying environments where people are under an awful lot of pressure. I often look more for the underlying cause than try and blame certain people. I would have a sort of a theory that no one is born bad, and people are just shaped by their environment. And people are shaped by their environment, and people in sports under an awful lot of pressure could be under pressure to do things that they otherwise wouldn't want to do in terms of how they speak to people, how they relate to people, the culture they develop or grow. And sport can be a harsh world. And of course, there are other things involved in that, like you said, fan opinions, club finances, league positions, travel, the relentless nature of travel. We see in, say, cricketers who might spend 10 months of the year away from their families. And so there are a number of stresses that are probably unique to sport, or at least enhanced in sport, that cause stress. And it can be an unforgiving place to work. And I sometimes find that personally, as well as in the people that I support.
Just as we look at that and we look at people, and every individual's different, as you've said, nature and nurture, people are formed. I did hear once when I was with an elite doctor for I think it was a national team, basically saying the elite of the elite have usually had some dysfunctional upbringing. And I don't know why they did share. I'm not. But what are the effective? So if we're stood on the sideline, either we see someone with an addiction, if we're aware that maybe they're making unhealthy choices or out of character choices. Let's say we knew someone a year ago and now they're not making quite the same choices. What are some of the effective treatments? So I guess the indicators are unhealthy choices in that sense. And I'm sure there are many more physical. As you said, there's a coach who's 70% or whatever that may be. But what are those other telltale signs? Because people are great at hiding. You know, I know people who've got certain addictions and no one knows because they hide it. They hide it really well. They hide, you know, it's like being depressed. You smile on the outside, but you're not smiling on the inside. What are these little things that we can look out for? And then what are the helpful, let's say, treatments or where we can, I won't say signposts, we'll come back to that later on, but what are those little things we can do maybe?
Yeah. So I think the best guide to spotting addictions or to helping a friend or colleague who we're concerned about will be to look at those symptoms that we mentioned, the symptoms of addiction. So an excessive use of a substance, for example, drinking too much, tolerance, for example, a person's using more of that substance to get the same effect. We sometimes think of that as sort of alcohol tolerance as if that's a good thing, you know, as if someone can drink more. But that is a biological effect whereby your liver is compensating for how much alcohol you're drinking by increasing liver enzymes. So tolerance, using more for the same effect, and neglect of the person's roles and the primacy of the substance, withdrawal symptoms, and some degree of harm. And it might be the harm that we start to spot. And harm can be quite subtle. A physical effect could be quite subtle at first. Now, thinking a bit about treatment and supporting other people, we would have mentioned in one of our earlier podcasts around depression, maybe about this stepped care model. It could be different steps, different approaches to dealing with a problem. And addictions would have that stepped care model. I'm going to start with the person themselves, and then I'm going to come back to that. Because, of course, in an addiction, the person themselves is probably the most important person in this narrative. But we can self-help. So I guess we can all look at ourselves and our actions and our behaviors and see whether anything's becoming habit forming. It's quite easy for alcohol use to creep up and to increase without us really noticing it. It's at first alcohol is a choice, and then it's something I do to manage stress, and then I can't wait for my drink on Friday at the end of work, and then alcohol can become a need, and it could creep up on us. And so we should self-monitor. Personally, I know we're sharing some personal stories, but personally, I tend to use Sober October and Dry January each year just to see if I can go for a month without drinking, and to I personally find, I lose a few pounds, which is always helpful when you're as middle-aged as you and I. So that's a helpful benefit. But I would use Sober October and Dry January to maybe just reset my social drinking. Helping a friend, like you said, that might be the next step. So just watching out for our community, those around us, maybe watching out for some of those signs without being judgmental, but having a sense of our friends and their needs. Then, of course, there are the common steps of treating any condition. There might be primary care solutions. Our GPs will have access to a whole range of different treatments. And within that primary care field, there are a lot of really good charities and charitable groups and third sector groups, such as Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous, or sometimes other groups that might touch on things like alcohol, such as Andy's Man Club or State of Mind, would have information around alcohol and substances in that third sector. Of course, some people need a secondary care intervention. They might need a medication. Now, without going into too much depth, some dependencies, of course, have a medication solution. Methadone is a substitute prescribing solution for people who are addicted to opiates, such as heroin. And there are similar medicines that we can use to help with people who have an alcohol addiction. But that's really probably at a quite severe end that we very rarely see in sports, more so in the general population. And coming all the way back to the person, I suppose maybe one thing to take away from today is that when I help people with an addiction, it really comes down to the person's own motivations. There's a group of therapies, a branch of therapy called motivational interviewing, which at its core is about working out the person's own motivations. Where do they see their alcohol or gambling or drug use? What's their view of it? How is it affecting them? What is their motivation for change? There's something called the stages of change, the pre-contemplative stage, the contemplative stage. People move through a pattern of thinking when they're thinking about changing. And where are the person's own motivations? And as I said, this therapy motivational interviewing really draws on that person's motivations. So with my coach, I would have intentionally spent quite a lot of time speaking to him about his role as a dad, knowing that for this particular coach, that's really important to him. It might be the most important aspect of his life. And so we would want to draw on a person's own motivations, because with many addictions, I think it's true to say the person's own motivation might be the most important factor in their success in terms of reducing or stopping that substance. So we need to find that person's motivations, what bothers them about their addiction, and how can we use that to help motivate change. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I guess the phrase, and this is a curveball, is people have to hit rock bottom. So people try and help people. I've seen this in many severe addictions, and they get them dry, do whatever they do, but that person then slips up or goes back to their poor habits. And it's only at some point when they really hit rock bottom, which is such a shame in that sense, that then they climb out. And I saw something the other day with someone celebrating, I think it was the ex-footballer and actor, his name's just got, I can see his face, celebrating 10 years of being sober, and other things like that, I guess, who then become role models. And we know Tony Adams, who set up Sporting Chance, was one of the reasons he set up that is because of his personal challenges. And I know we as an organisation partner with GamCare, which is all about helping people who suffer the ramifications of someone with gambling addiction. Yeah.
And a great organisation, GamCare, I should have mentioned, one of those great third sector organisations that can really access people probably in a different way to primary or secondary care in the NHS. Yeah.
And some of that is about that awareness, isn't it? And some of that, and I guess as we close on this section, because addictions is so wide and so extreme because it looks different in each person. What are the things that if you've suffered from an addiction, I think we've all got a propensity. I know I don't agree with gambling, but I know if I ever get on one of those machines, I can't carry on. It's like it don't make sense. The adrenaline of winning, and I guess if you've got, I've heard this statement, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong. If you've got a propensity of addiction in one area, you've got does that mean you're weaker in other areas?
Yeah, I wouldn't describe it as weak. I know you mean. Yes, susceptible. Certainly, one dependency could lead to another. And there are also things called gateway drugs, where a person might start using one substance and end up using other substances, things that may be more harmful. You're describing there the reward mechanism of substances, aren't there? And whether it's food or illicit drugs or alcohol, there can be a reward mechanism, a squirt of dopamine in our cortex that rewards a behavior. And behaviors can become conditioned. Good behaviors can become conditioned. We can fall into good habits as well as unhelpful habits. And so certainly, there's a reward pathway behind each of these addictions, and originally starts off as being something pleasant and fun or enjoyable, but can become too strict of a habit, too excessive, too harmful, and might eventually develop into harmful or addictive use of the substance. So yeah, I think coming back to your question around treatment, we really need to work out that person's motivations. And sometimes, like I said, like you said, if someone hits rock bottom, their motivations become clear to them. The only way is up. Everything needs to improve, I suppose, at rock bottom. But if we can help a person before they hit rock bottom, it's usually through working out their motivations. My coach was 70% of the coach he wanted to be, in his own words, and he wanted to be 95% of the coach that he could be, or even grow himself and exceed that. And he had motivations around sports, also around family, seeing his children. And once we can find a person's motivations are things that would really drive their change for them, which is often very personal to the person, then that's the gold dust. You're on to the person's reason for change. And then we just need to support and encourage, the behaviors that we want to see. So it's quite individual and hard to generalize. But if you find the person's core motivations are things that they're really unhappy with about their addictions or things they want to achieve, then that's the fuel that drives the car that can change behavior.
I love to dig. I know we've probably come to our time today on that. But I'd love to dig a little bit deeper on that, on the whole motivation and maybe how we can help people keep on the right track, for a better phrase, or certainly get back on the right track through understanding people's motivation and, as you say, finding the fuel that drives the car in the right direction. That's really helpful. And I love the step care, the model. If people are listening to this and we've only just, I guess, scratched the surface on many of these issues, and you've got some concerns, as Dr. Allan has already stated, there's some great organizations out there. So let's just go through those processes. If there's a third sector like GAM Care or Sporting Chance, if you're in elite sport, where would you initially go for that first point of reference?
Yes, so certainly in the range of organisations, as a member of the general public, your GP would have access to a whole range of different services, but all of these services now will be online. And through a simple sort of online search, you might find the relevant service for you. It could be a regional service, Yorkshire's this service, or it could be a national service like an Alcoholics Anonymous. So certainly online or via your GP, you'll have access to one of these steps of the care model, with that third sector being such an important step. But it probably also just comes back to ourselves monitoring, gently monitoring our own activities, asking ourselves if what we're doing is healthy and pleasurable and productive, or that it has unhelpful aspects to it. And if you see some form of harm, you might find some degree of motivation just to fine tune and adapt your activities a little bit. And as I said, I might do that each October and January, where I sort of see if I can get through the month. And normally after those months and the months following, my own behaviors change, change long term, as in I sort of reset the amount that I find it helpful to drink, if that makes sense. So maybe a bit of self-monitoring is probably the place to start.
That's really helpful, Dr. Allan. As always, those little nuggets, those signposting are very helpful. I'm sure our listeners have found that helpful today. This is the third of a 5-series podcast. There's been depression, anxiety, and now addictions. Why don't you go back and listen to some of them? If some of those things have hit you, please don't hesitate to email us at admin@sportschaplaincy.org.uk, and we will help you the best way we can by either giving you signposting in the right direction or certainly pointing you in the right direction of someone who can help you in this challenging season. So we hope you've enjoyed today. We hope you found it helpful, and we wish you all the best. Take care.
Thank you.